The kids worried me so bad. Mom, Mom, when are we gonna get the internet? You feel like, you know, a caveman because we can't access the same things everybody else does.
Until this year, Cindy Hartman and her kids had no reliable internet service. They live in rural Virginia, an area deserted by the big telecom companies like Comcast, who don't see them as a worthwhile investment. And they're not alone. About 20% of people living in rural America lack reliable internet access. And for millions more, the cost of broadband is out of reach and the service is unreliable. Now a solution could be on the way. Publicly owned municipal broadband. But big telecom giants are fighting to stop them.
Broadband in rural America is what's called a market failure. We've kind of given it to the private market, and they've picked and choose where they want to provide service. And oftentimes that means that sparsely populated areas, rural remote areas, don't get the type of service that we'd like to see. There's just not enough people there to merit that kind of return on investment that profit-driven shareholder companies want to see.
In other words, the companies go where the customers are. And that's fine for most businesses, but it gets problematic when it comes to ones providing crucial services, like the internet.
So, like, whenever we had online school for COVID, since we had no internet and we were in such a remote location, you could not turn in the work on time ever. So I would always get late penalties, and it was basically impossible for me to get anything above like a 70.
Even the hotspot they sent did not work well. And he ended up having to repeat half of his ninth grade in his sophomore year.
Historically, the internet in the United States has been treated more like a luxury good than a right, even though it's needed to compete in today's increasingly digital world. But it's not profitable for big telecom companies to build broadband infrastructure that reaches rural communities, or ensure connections are reliable. In fact, telecom giants have spent hundreds of millions of dollars to ensure broadband remains expensive and spotty. Even when the government has tried to close the digital divide and subsidize broadband deployment, the lack of public oversight and absence of competition has meant that big telecom providers are securing these funds without actually addressing the problem at hand.
So before the pandemic, the federal government was spending somewhere between $5 and $7 billion a year on subsidizing broadband deployment to rural communities, where a provider can come in, get a subsidy from the federal government, and deploy high-speed broadband. At least that's how it should be working. What we often found is that a lot of this money was being spent on deploying what we might think about now as like subpar technologies. In fact, between 2009 and 2017, the GAO reports that we spent $47 billion on broadband deployment alone. And yet the digital divide has not only really shrunk, but it might be getting bigger in terms of who is connected with the best technologies and who is still kind of languishing with old telephone models, for instance.
In the most egregious cases, companies took the government's money but failed to do the work. But this isn't the first time we've seen this type of market failure for an essential service, and solved it. The US faced an almost identical problem electrifying the country in the 1930s. That's when FDR created the Rural Electrification Act. The big difference between that and what we see today? The money from the government didn't go to telecom giants driven by greed and delivering for shareholders. It went directly to communities, specifically to farmers, to try and solve the problem themselves. And they did, creating hundreds of electric cooperatives across the country, many of which are still in existence today. Right now, we have an opportunity to right our recent wrongs and learn from the past. As part of the 2021 infrastructure bill, the Biden administration allocated over $42 billion with the intention of closing the digital divide. We can guess what will happen if big telecom giants secure yet more funding, but we wanted to see what might happen if local municipal broadband companies got the money instead.
Comcast and Verizon both have a presence in Orange County, but it's almost exclusively in areas like the two towns where there's some density of population. Their footprint in the rural area is almost non-existent, even to today. The first challenge was the recognition that we're not going to get any help If we do this, we're gonna have to try to do it ourselves.
FiberLink is a municipal broadband network that launched in April 2021 and is run by a local public entity instead of a private company. Municipal networks have been growing increasingly popular alongside some of those electrical cooperatives who are now laying fiber on the same lines, taking the challenge of wiring their communities into their own hands.
That's primarily the driving force behind the county creating the Orange County Broadband Authority to say, okay, let's address this problem head on and see what we can do.
Today, FiberLink serves about 7,500 homes that otherwise might never have been connected.
For rural communities, it might mean the difference between keeping young people in your community or attracting new businesses into your community.
And businesses in rural communities in this century looks a lot different than the picture in many people's mind. And it doesn't work without broadband.
So our dairy, we used to have a parlor where people will actually have to milk the cows, hook up the connections to the cows twice a day. When we converted to this robotic dairy, actually what we do is we don't do anything. The cows milk themselves. If they produce enough milk to milk 4 times a day, that's what they do, and they can do it any time that they like.
Deanne Marshall and her husband Keith run a dairy farm in the country that's been in their family for more than 40 years.
We would not be able to function as a whole without a fiber link and having fiber availability in this rural community.
This is the reality far beyond robotic dairy farms.
In the next 50 years, we are going to need to double our food supply because the population is growing so much. The kicker, we're out of arable land, particularly in the United States. We need to be more efficient with our farming. And what is called precision agriculture helps us become more efficient. That means putting sensors in the ground, that means having sensors in your combine or your harvester. The way those sensors talk to each other, broadband.
Municipal broadband companies like FiberLink have proved they can do what big telecom won't: provide good, reliable service to communities too often left behind. But to bring projects to scale, municipal broadband networks need financial support from the federal government.
We're trying to do it as best we can with some internal funds. You know, we can only do it as fast as we generate revenue ourselves, and so it's going to take a while. So that's the biggest remaining challenge, I think.
FiberLink and other municipal networks are bidding against big telecom companies to access the Biden administration's new funds.
The argument against municipal broadband often comes from the larger ISPs who say that public investment distorts, big quotation marks, the free market. Where on the other hand, what we often see with municipal broadband is that these are networks that exist because there either isn't an incumbent or the community is dissatisfied with their incumbent. And municipal broadband is often cheaper than the incumbent and faster than the incumbent. And it's become a desirable option for a number of communities who can't find, sometimes even with funding, a broadband provider to come in and offer adequate, affordable service.
That's why Biden's Broadband Equity, Access and Development, BEAD program is so promising, assuming it falls into the right hands. And that's going to take a big public support campaign, because lobbyists for telecom giants are already spending record amounts of money to prevent municipal networks from accessing this funding and increasing competition. This fight isn't just playing out at a national level. 17 states have explicit prohibitions on municipal broadband. Telecom companies are lobbying heavily to maintain those restrictions.
This is one of the concerns, again, with large incumbent providers who can kind of just roll in with a lot of lawyers and a lot of really splashy applications. And we need to make sure that smaller providers are being given the same chance to be awarded funding as large providers. It's still not going to be enough to solve the digital divide, but it's going to be a huge dent if the money is spent well. Everything is on the line right now when it comes to connectivity.
Thank you so much for watching, and if content like this is important for you, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you for supporting our work.